90 birds crammed into 3-wire crates in the bed of a rusted pickup, and every one of them screeching like the world was ending. And Wren Callahan didn't flinch once as she counted out the last of her folding money into the open, calloused palm of a man who plainly thought she'd lost her mind. The birds were guinea fowl, mottled gray and speckled white, their bald blue and red heads swiveling on necks too thin to look like they belonged to bodies that round. And they made a racket that could carry a half-mile across the flat bottomland of Sablewood Hollow. Nobody wanted them. That was the whole point of the sale. The man selling them, a fellow named Odell Marsh, who'd inherited them along with a foreclosed hobby farm, he couldn't unload fast enough, had been trying to give them away for 2 weeks, and the only offers he'd gotten were from a man who wanted to shoot them for target practice and another who wanted them for stew. Guineas were loud, guineas were dumb, guineas flew into fences and roosted in trees and laid their eggs in secret nests you'd never find, and they screamed at everything, and there wasn't a lick of money in 'em. Everybody in the valley knew that, so when word went around that the Callahan girl, the quiet one who'd come back to her late grandmother's place out on Thistledown Road, had driven 40 minutes to buy the whole lot for $400, the men outside the auction barn shook their heads the way men do when they've already decided the ending of a story. Before we go on, if you believe some things get written off too fast, do me a small favor and tap that like button and leave a comment telling me what town or county you're watching from, because I like knowing where these stories land. Now let's get back to Wren and those 90 screaming birds. She was 23 that spring, and she had not come back to Sablewood Hollow because she had a plan. She'd come back because there was nowhere else that felt like anything, and because the little house on Thistledown Road had gone empty when her grandmother Ada passed the previous November, and somebody had to be there or the taxes would eat it and the county would take it, and that would be the end of 4 generations of Callahans on that particular patch of red clay and river silt. Wren had been living 2 states over, working the register at a garden center and renting a room from a woman who kept the thermostat at 60 and counted the eggs in the refrigerator. When the lawyer called about the house, Wren gave 2 weeks' notice she didn't have to give and drove home with everything she owned in the back seat and a milk crate of her grandmother's letters on the passenger side. The place was 91 acres, most of it useless by the reckoning of the men who farmed the good bottomland downriver. There were maybe 15 acres you could plow, and the rest was scrub and cedar and bramble and a long tongue of woods that ran up the ridge, and it had never made anybody rich and had never been meant to. Ada had kept goats and a garden and a dozen laying hens, and she'd gotten by, and getting by was a thing people in the hollow understood as an accomplishment rather than a disappointment. The trouble that would eventually make Wren's $90 dozen guineas the most wanted birds in 3 counties had not arrived yet that spring. It was coming. It came up out of the south on the backs of deer, and on the wind and in the tall grass. And it came slow the way the worst things do, but in that first April, nobody was thinking about ticks. They were thinking about the drought that had broken early, and the cattle prices and whether the Petroni outfit was going to buy up the old Hames ground, and they were thinking, some of them, about the strange sight of Wren Callahan turning those birds loose on her grandmother's overgrown acres and just letting them go. She didn't build them a proper coop at first. She didn't clip their wings. She opened the crates one evening near dusk and stood back and watched 90 guinea fowl explode out into the failing light and scatter into the cedars, screaming, and she thought she might have just thrown $400 into the woods. But she'd read something, and she'd remembered something, and she had a reason, and the reason was written in her grandfather's hand in a ledger she'd found under a loose board in the smokehouse, and she hadn't told a soul about it because there was no one to tell who wouldn't laugh. Her grandfather had been Silas Callahan, dead 11 years now, a man Wren barely remembered except as a smell of pipe smoke and a pair of hands that could gentle any animal on the place. He'd kept guineas himself, back in the 70s, a smaller flock, and in his ledger in the cramped pencil script that leaned hard to the right, he'd written a line that Wren had read a dozen times before she understood it. "The birds pay their board in what they eat," he'd written, and under it a list: squash bugs, grasshoppers, beetles, and ticks. He'd underlined ticks twice. There was a date next to it, the summer of 1976, and a note that said fewer on the dogs this year and the cattle not bothered on the high pasture. Wren had grown up on stories of her grandfather's stubbornness, how he'd refused to spray his garden when everyone else did, how he'd let his fence rows grow wild for the quail, how the men at the feed store had called him behind his back, a crank into his face, nothing at all, because he was the kind of quiet that made loud men careful. She'd inherited that quiet. She sat on the porch that first night with the ledger in her lap and the birds settling into the black cedars, one still screaming somewhere out in the dark, and she decided she would find out if her grandfather had been a crank or a man who'd noticed something. The first person to tell her flat out that she'd wasted her money was a man named Burl Tannehill, who ran the biggest cow-calf operation in the valley and who had opinions the way other men had loose change, always jingling, always ready to hand out. She met him at the feed store in the little crossroads town of Marrow Creek, where she'd gone for scratch grain and a roll of hardware cloth, and he looked at the guinea feed in her cart and then at her and asked her, not unkindly, exactly what she thought she was doing. She told him she'd bought Odell Marsh's guineas. Burl laughed, a short bark of a laugh, and said Odell Marsh had been trying to unload those devils for a month, and she must be the only fool in the county who'd take them off his hands. Guineas, he said, were good for exactly one thing, and that was waking you up at 4 in the morning and giving you a reason to buy a shotgun. She'd be lucky, he said, if half of them didn't wander off or get taken by coyotes inside a month, and the ones that stayed would tear up her garden and lay eggs where she'd never find them and give her nothing back for the feed. That's just a fact, he said, offering it the way he offered all his facts, as a kindness she was too young to appreciate. Wren thanked him for the advice, paid for her scratch grain, and drove home. She wrote in her own notebook that night, a green spiral-bound thing she'd started keeping because her grandfather had kept one. Burl Tannehill says they'll be gone in a month. She dated it. She would come back to that page. They were not gone in a month. That was the first small thing that surprised the people watching, though nobody said anything out loud yet. Wren lost 4 birds the first 2 weeks, 2 to something in the night and 2 that simply vanished. And then the flock settled. Guineas, it turned out, were creatures of ferocious loyalty to place once they decided a place was theirs. And Wren had done the one thing that made them stay, which was to feed them a little scratch every evening at the same spot near the old smokehouse, so that no matter how far they ranged across the 90 acres by day, they came pouring back at dusk in a gray speckled tide, screaming their heads off, to peck up the grain and roost in the cedar she decided to let them have. She built them a low shelter out of the hardware cloth and some scavenged boards, more for the winter than anything, and she learned their sounds, the difference between the alarm scream that meant a hawk and the chattering that meant they'd found something good in the grass, and she followed them sometimes just to see what they ate. They ate everything. They worked the fence rows in a line like a search party, flipping leaves and stabbing at the ground, and where they'd been, the grasshoppers thinned and the squash bugs disappeared, and the little ground-crawling things that plague a garden simply stopped being a problem. Wren's garden that first summer was the cleanest anybody could remember, and she hadn't sprayed it once. And when Ada's old neighbor, Marlene Voss, came by for tomatoes and remarked on it, Wren just said it was the birds, and Marlene laughed the same laugh Burl had, and told the story at the beauty shop in Marrow Creek, and that was how the legend of the crazy Callahan girl and her useless guineas began to travel. What nobody knew, because Wren didn't advertise it and wouldn't have known how to prove it if she'd tried, was that she'd started walking the property line every week with her grandfather's ledger habits in mind, and she'd started counting. Not the birds, the ticks. She'd take a white flannel cloth and drag it through the tall grass along the ridge trail where the deer came through, the way she'd read about, and she'd count what stuck to it. And she wrote the numbers in the green notebook. In May, dragging the cloth for 100 yards near the north fence, she picked up 31 ticks. She dragged the same 100 yards in June and picked up 19. In July, 11. The birds were working outward from the smokehouse in widening circles, following the season, and everywhere they worked the numbers fell, and Wren watched the numbers fall and said nothing to anyone, because a thing you can't yet prove is a thing loud men will laugh at, and she had learned from her grandfather that you don't argue with a laugh. You let the years argue for you. She almost let it stay a private thing. She almost kept it to herself entirely, tending her strange, quiet experiment out on Thistledown Road while the valley went about its business. But the valley's business was about to change, and the change came in on the deer, just as her grandfather had guessed 47 years before, and it had a name that would soon be in every mouth in Sablewood Hollow. It started with a horse. Late that first August, a woman named Cora Deverell, who boarded a few horses out past the Marrow Creek Bridge, lost a mare to something the vet couldn't name at first, a wasting fever, and then found the animal's ears and the soft skin of its belly crawling with ticks in numbers she'd never seen in 20 years of keeping horses. Then the patronus, who'd bought the old Hames ground after all and stocked it heavy with cattle, started losing calves to a blood parasite. The extension office finally identified, carried by a tick that had crept up from the south on a warming climate and an exploding deer herd. And there was no easy poison for it, and the county agent stood up at a meeting in the fire hall and used the word plague, and then took it back, and then everybody used it anyway. By September, the ticks were in everything. They were on the dogs so thick that people were pulling 40 and 50 a day off a single animal. They were in the deer, which staggered thin and sick along the roads. 2 children in the valley came down with a fever and a rash, and a doctor 40 miles off said the word he'd been afraid to say, and after that, nobody laughed about ticks anymore. The men who ran cattle were dipping and spraying and burning their pastures and losing money hand over fist, and the ticks kept coming, because you cannot spray a whole valley, and you cannot poison the deer, and the tall grass held them like a reservoir that refilled itself every morning with dew. And out on Thistledown Road, on Wren Callahan's 91 acres, there were almost none. She noticed it the way you notice a silence, gradually, as a thing that should be there and isn't. Her own dog, a rough-coated stray she'd named Piston for the way he ran, came in clean night after night while every other dog in the county was crawling. She dragged her white flannel cloth along the ridge trail in September and picked up 2 ticks in 100 yards, and she stood there in the cooling evening with the cloth in her hand and the flock working the grass below her, screaming their idiot heads off, flipping leaves and stabbing the ground and eating, always eating. And she understood that her grandfather had been right, and that the men at the feed store 47 years ago had been wrong, and that she was standing in the middle of the only proof that would ever matter, which was not an argument but a fact you could measure with a cloth and a season. She wrote the number in her notebook, 2. She underlined it twice, the way Silas had underlined ticks, and she did not tell anyone, not yet, because she had learned that the thing you say too early gets laughed at, and the thing that proves itself gets believed, and she was content, for a while longer, to let the birds do the talking they did so poorly and so well. But you cannot keep a thing like that quiet in a valley the size of Sablewood Hollow, where the gas station at the Marrow Creek crossroads was the true county seat, and Delphine Okafor behind the register knew everything worth knowing before the people it happened to did. It was Delphine who first put it together, because she watched the whole valley file through her door all fall complaining about ticks, pulling their sleeves down over bites, buying every tube of repellent and every flea and tick collar she could keep in stock. And she noticed that Wren Callahan came in for her coffee and her gas and never complained about ticks at all. and that Wren's dog Piston, who rode along in the truck bed, was slick and clean when every other dog in the parking lot was a horror. Delphine was not a shy woman. She asked Wren straight out one October morning how it was that her animals stayed clean when the whole valley was eaten alive. And Wren, who had been waiting without knowing she was waiting for someone to ask her a real question, told her the truth. "It was the guineas," she said. "They eat the ticks. My grandfather figured it out in 1976, and I've got the numbers to prove it." Delphine looked at her for a long moment, and then she laughed, but it was a different kind of laugh than Burl's had been, a laugh of delight rather than dismissal, and she said, "Well, I'll be." And by that afternoon she had told 9 people, and by the end of the week she had told 90, and the story that had started as the joke about the crazy Callahan girl and her useless birds began, very slowly, to turn itself inside out. The first person to come to Wren about buying guineas was Cora Deverell, the horsewoman, who had lost the one mare and was terrified of losing more, and who had heard from Delphine that the Callahan place was clean. She drove out to Thistledown Road on a gray Saturday and stood at the fence looking at the flock, the way people look at something they've been told is medicine, with hope and suspicion mixed, and she asked Wren if it was true. Wren didn't oversell it. That was a thing people would remark on later, how she never oversold anything, never promised what she couldn't measure. She showed Cora the green notebook, the numbers falling month by month, 31 to 19 to 11 to 2. She said guineas won't fix a tick problem overnight, and they won't work in a barn, and they need room to range, and they'll drive you half mad with the noise. But she said, if you turn enough of them loose on ground and feed them enough to keep them home, they will clear the ticks off that ground inside a couple of seasons, because that is what they do. It is the one thing God built them to do better than anything else. And everybody who ever laughed at them for the noise and the flying and the dumb bald heads never bothered to notice the one thing they were for. Cora bought a dozen Keats, the little striped guinea chicks Wren had started hatching from the eggs she now knew how to find, and she paid $90 for the dozen, which was more than anyone in the valley had ever paid for a guinea in the history of the valley. And she drove home with them peeping in a box on her front seat, and she did not think she'd been robbed. She thought she'd bought insurance. Wren hadn't planned to hatch Keats to sell. That, too, was a thing that grew the way everything on the place grew, by attention rather than ambition. She'd started hunting the hidden nests that summer because she was curious how many eggs the hens were laying out in the brush, and she'd found them. Cunning little caches of pointed speckled eggs tucked under the cedars and along the fence rows. And rather than let them hatch wild and get taken by predators, she'd started collecting them and running them under a couple of broody hens, and in a second-hand incubator she'd bought with the first of Cora's $90. She learned that guinea Keats were fragile for the first weeks and hardy as boot leather after, that they had to be kept warm and dry and then could be turned out to follow the flock, that a guinea hen made a terrible mother and a broody chicken made a fine one. She kept notes on all of it, hatch rates and losses, and which hens laid where, filling the green notebook and then a second one. And she priced the Keats at $90 a dozen. Not because she'd studied the market, there was no market, but because that was the number that came to her. And it turned out to be exactly the number a frightened cattleman would pay when the alternative was watching his calves waste away. She sold Cora's dozen, and then a dozen to Marlene Voss, who'd stopped laughing, and then 2 dozen to a man from over the ridge she'd never met who'd heard it at the gas station, and by the time the leaves were down, she had a waiting list written in the back of the notebook, an order she couldn't fill until spring hatching. It was around then that Burl Tannehill drove out to Thistledown Road, and this is the part of the story people in the hollow still tell, because Burl was the one who'd said it loudest, that the birds would be gone in a month and give her nothing back for the feed. And Burl was losing calves that fall like everyone else, worse than most, because he ran the most cattle, and Burl was not a man who found it easy to be wrong in public. He didn't come to buy, not at first. He came, he said, to see for himself, which was a thing men said when they meant they could not bear to hear about a thing second-hand any longer. He stood at Wren's fence with his hat in his hands and watched the flock come pouring in at dusk, 90-odd birds and now more, screaming across the darkening field, and he watched them work the grass, and he was quiet for a long time, which was not like him. Then he asked to see the numbers. Wren got the notebook. He read it slowly, running a thick finger down the columns, the tick counts falling season over season, the dates, the 100-yard drags along the ridge, and when he got to the page where she'd written Burl Tannehill, says they'll be gone in a month, he stopped and read that line twice and then looked at her. And Wren looked back at him and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that the notebook hadn't already said better. He didn't make a large production out of it. That was the thing about Burl that people had forgotten in all the years of his jingling opinions, that under the noise he was, at bottom, a man who respected a fact when it finally cornered him. He handed the notebook back and he said, "Well, your granddaddy always did notice things the rest of us walked past. He said Silas Callahan had told him once, back when Burl was a young man just starting out, that he was spraying his fence rows to death and killing the very things that kept his pastures whole. And Burl had thought the old man was a crank and had said as much, maybe not to his face, but close enough. And now here was the old man's granddaughter with a green notebook proving him right 40-some years on. Burl asked how many keats she could let him have. Wren said her spring hatch was spoken for through May, but she could put him down for June. He said he'd take 100. 100, she said, and wrote it in the book, and he paid a deposit in cash from a fold of bills as thick as the one he'd once watched her count out to Odell Marsh. And before he left, he stood at the fence one more time and watched the birds and said, more to himself than to her, that he'd have never believed it. Then he put his hat on and drove back to his dying calves to wait out the winter. And Wren wrote in the notebook, under the old line about the month, the date, and 2 words, Burl came. She didn't underline it. Some things don't need underlining. The winter was hard on the valley and easy on Wren's 91 acres comparatively, and by the time the ground thawed, the story had traveled past the county line. A woman from the University Extension Office drove out to Thistledown Road in March, a soil and livestock specialist named Priya Chandrasekhar, who'd heard about the tick-free Callahan place through the tangle of rural word of mouth that runs faster and truer than any journal, and she came, frankly, expecting to debunk it. She'd seen 100 country cures that didn't hold up. She sat at Wren's kitchen table with the 2 green notebooks open in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and she read the tick counts, and she asked about the drag method and the transects and how often and where. And Wren answered every question flatly and completely, and Priya's expression changed slowly from professional skepticism to something closer to hunger. The data wasn't perfect, she said. It was one property, no control site, kept by an amateur. But the method was sound and the numbers were consistent, and they matched, she said, a handful of studies out of Africa and one old one out of the American South that everyone had forgotten, showing that guinea fowl at sufficient density could suppress tick populations dramatically on pasture and edge habitat. She asked if she could come back and set up proper transects, a real study, with a control site and repeated measures across a full season. Wren said she could on one condition, which was that when it was written up, it said clearly that a man named Silas Callahan had figured it out in 1976 with nothing but a white cloth and a habit of noticing, so that nobody would ever be able to say again that it was expert knowledge that saved the valley, when it was really just an old man everybody had called a crank. Priya said she'd write exactly that, and she did, eventually, though that was still 2 years off. Spring came and the hatching started in earnest, and Wren's operation, if you could call it that, grew the only way she would let it grow, which was slowly and without debt, and pulled along by demand rather than pushed by ambition. She never took out a loan. She was offered one more than once by a bank man in Marrow Creek who'd seen the traffic on Thistledown Road and smelled a business worth financing, and she told him no the same flat way she told everyone no, that she'd build what the birds could pay for and not a bird more. She bought a second incubator with Keat money, and then a third, and she fenced a proper brooder yard with Keat money, and she hired the Voss boy, Marlene's grandson Toby, 16 and needing work, to help her run the eggs and clean the brooders and drive the deliveries, and she paid him in cash and taught him everything she knew, which by then was a great deal. She learned that different ground needed different densities, that a heavy tick load needed 30 or 40 birds to the acre working it, and a maintenance flock could be fewer, that the birds needed cover from hawks and a reliable feeding spot to hold them home and water in the dry months, and she wrote all of it down and gave a photocopied sheet of it to everyone who bought Keats, so that they'd succeed, because a bird that failed on somebody's place was a story that would travel just as fast as a bird that worked. She was, though she'd never have used the word, building a reputation, and she built it the way Silas had built his, out of being right and being quiet about it. By that second summer the valley had changed. You could see it if you knew where to look. The Deverell horse pasture was clean, and Cora had lost no more mares. Marlene Voss's dogs came in without a tick on them, and Burl Tannehill's 100 guineas, turned out in June the year before, and now grown and breeding, worked his big pastures in gray-speckled companies, and Burl's calves that year did not waste, and Burl, who had never in his life given credit where it cost him anything, stood up at the same fire hall meeting where the county agent had once said the word plague, and said in front of the whole valley that he'd been wrong about the Callahan girls' birds, and that anybody still spraying and dipping and losing money ought to drive out to Thistledown Road and buy some Keats and stop being as big a fool as he'd been. It was the closest thing to an apology a man like Burl was ever going to make, and Wren, who was in the back of the room because Delphine had made her come, accepted it with a small nod and said nothing, and afterward more than one man who'd laughed at her at the feed store 2 summers before came up to shake her hand and put his name on her list, and she wrote them all down in the green notebook, $90 a dozen, June hatch, spring hatch, the following year, the list running longer than she could fill. There was one visit that mattered more than all the handshakes, though, and it happened quietly, the way the important things on the place always happened, with no one much around to see it. Wren's great-aunt Bess, Silas's younger sister, was the last of that generation of Callahans still living, 89 years old and sharp as a tack, and living in a nursing home over in the county seat. And she had not been able to come to Ada's funeral, and had not been out to the home place in a decade. But she heard about the birds. Everyone heard about the birds. And one afternoon that second summer, Toby drove out to fetch her in Wren's truck, and brought her slow up the lane in a wheelchair, and set her at the fence in the shade of the cedar to watch the flock come in at dusk. Bess wore a man's flannel shirt and a pair of trousers, and did not seem to feel she needed to explain either, because at 89 she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her comfortable, and she sat there with her spotted hands folded in her lap and watched the guineas come screaming across the field in the gold evening light. And she was quiet for a long while, and then she said, "Your granddaddy did this same thing right here in this same field, the year you'd have been minus 20 years old." Wren said she knew. She'd found the ledger. Bess nodded slowly and said, "Silas used to say a thing," and she said it. And it was the line that Wren had been circling around for 2 years, without ever quite finding the words for it herself. "The worth of a thing," Bess said, "isn't in what folks say about it. It's in what it does when nobody's watching." That was Silas, she said. That was him all over. He didn't argue. He just waited for the ground to prove him right. Wren wrote it in the notebook that night, word for word. "The worth of a thing isn't in what folks say about it. It's in what it does when nobody's watching. And she found herself saying it back to people over the next years without ever telling them where it came from. And it spread the way the birds had spread, quietly, from one person to the next, until it was just a thing people said in the hollow. An old saying nobody could quite source, which is the truest kind of monument a person can leave. Bess died that winter, in her sleep, in the nursing home, and Wren was with her the day before and held her hand and did not cry until she got out to the truck, and then she cried the way you cry for the last of a generation, the last person alive who'd known your grandfather as a young man, the last mouth that could speak his sayings in his own cadence. She buried Bess next to Silas and Ada in the little family plot on the ridge, where you could hear the guineas working the grass below, and she thought, standing there in the cold, that there was a kind of justice in it, that the two people who'd believed in the birds and in the quiet way of proving a thing were laid in ground, the birds now kept clean, and that the men who'd laughed were the ones still spraying and dipping and buying Keats from her at $90 a dozen. The study came out the third year, in a journal Wren never read, and a summary Priya Chandrasekhar mailed her with a note, and it said everything Priya had promised it would say, that guinea fowl at appropriate density significantly reduced tick abundance in edge and pasture habitat, and it credited, in a paragraph Priya had fought her editors to keep, the observations of one Silas Callahan of Sablewood Hollow, whose unpublished records from 1976 had anticipated the finding by nearly half a century. Wren clipped that paragraph and pinned it inside the smokehouse door, next to the loose board where she'd found the ledger, and she never framed it or showed it off, but it was there, and she knew it was there, and that was enough. The Extension Office started recommending guinea fowl as part of an integrated tick management approach across the region, and the demand for Keats outran anything Wren could produce, and she got calls from 3 counties over and then from across the state line, and still she would not scale it up the way the bank man, and eventually a small agricultural company wanted her to. A representative from that company came out and offered to buy her operation and her method and her name, and painted her a picture of guinea Keats shipped nationwide and Wren's face on a bag of specialty feed, and Wren looked at him across the same kitchen table where Priya had once sat, and looked at him for a long, quiet moment, the way she looked at everything before she acted, and then she said no. She said she'd build it the way she'd built everything, one hatch at a time, on ground she owned free and clear, and that when she couldn't fill an order, she'd teach the person who wanted the birds how to hatch their own, because the point was never to be the only place that had them. The point was to make the whole valley the kind of place the birds had made her 91 acres. And that, more than the money, is what happened over the years that followed, slowly, the only way anything real happens. Wren taught. She held a hatching day every spring, an informal thing that grew into a tradition, where anyone who'd bought Keats could come learn to find the wild nests and run the eggs and raise the fragile Keats through their delicate weeks. And the Voss boy Toby, grown now and gone to the university to study wildlife biology on the strength of what he'd learned on Thistledown Road, would come back to help her run it. She sold Keats and she gave away knowledge, and she watched year over year the tick counts fall across the whole valley, not just on her ground, but on the Deverell place and the Voss place and the Petroni place, and even, eventually, on the big spreads that had scoffed longest, until the Extension Office stopped using the word plague at its meetings, and the children stopped coming down with the fever, and the dogs came in clean, and the deer, the ones that were left, walked the fence rows sleek instead of staggering. It did not happen because anyone sprayed the valley or poisoned the deer or spent a fortune. It happened because a quiet young woman had noticed what an old man had noticed before her, and had refused to be laughed out of it, and had let the ground do her arguing, one season at a time, until the whole valley was proof. Burl Tannehill grew old and sold most of his cattle and kept his guineas, and in his last years he was one of the loudest voices telling anybody who'd listen that the smartest thing he ever did was drive out to the Callahan place with his hat in his hands and admit he'd been wrong. He'd built a friendship with Wren out of that admission, an unlikely one, the old cattleman and the quiet woman half his age, and he'd sit at her fence in the evening sometimes and watch the birds come in and tell her stories about her grandfather. And it was Burl in the end who paid to have a small bronze plaque made and set on a stone by the smokehouse. And he didn't ask Wren's permission because he knew she'd have told him not to. And it read simply, "In memory of Silas Callahan, who noticed." When Wren found it, she stood and looked at it for a long time in her way. And then she went and got a rag and polished the fresh bronze. And she left it, because Burl had earned the right to that gesture the way Bess had earned the right to her trousers, and because it was true. Wren Callahan is an older woman now, though not old, still out on Thistledown Road, still on the 91 acres, and the flock is descended in an unbroken line from Odell Marsh's 90 screaming birds. And it still comes pouring in at dusk in a gray-speckled tide, screaming its idiot beautiful head off. And she still keeps a green notebook, though the numbers in it now are so small, some pages she writes a single figure, 1 or none, and does not need to underline it because the whole valley knows what it means. She never married and she was never lonely, because the place was full of birds and of the endless stream of people who came to learn, and the young ones like Toby who came back. And she used to say, when someone asked her how she'd known, that she hadn't known anything, that she'd just been paying attention to a man who'd paid attention before her, and that the worth of a thing isn't in what folks say about it. It's in what it does when nobody's watching. She'd say it flatly, the way Bess had said it, the way Silas had lived it, and then she'd nod toward the field where $90 worth of birds nobody wanted had turned into the thing that saved a valley. And she wouldn't say anything else, because the field said it better, the same way it had always said everything better, one clean season at a time. If this story moved you, do something with it. Send it to someone who's been told that the thing they love, the thing they see worth in, isn't worth the trouble, because sometimes all a person needs is proof that the world comes around eventually to the ones who wait. Leave me a comment about a time you were underestimated and turned out right, or about a person in your own life who noticed what everyone else walked past. Tell me the town or the county or the country you're watching from, because these stories find their way to the most unexpected corners, and I like to know where they land. And know that I read every single comment, every one, the same way Wren read every line in that green notebook, slowly and with attention, because the worth of a thing isn't in what folks say about it, it's in what it does when nobody's watching. And I've found that's true of comments as often as it's true of birds. And yet the story did not quite end there, at the fence in the evening light, because stories that root themselves in ground the way this one don't end so much as they seed. There came a spring, some years on, when Wren was 60, and Toby was a man of 36 with a doctorate and a position at the very extension office that had once sent Priya Chandrasekhar out to debunk her, and he drove out to Thistledown Road, not as a helper anymore, but as a scientist with a proposal folded on the seat beside him. He wanted, he said, to make the hatching day official, not to change it, not to take it anywhere, only to fund it, so that the knowledge Wren had been given away for free could keep being given away for free after she was gone, which was a sentence he had rehearsed a dozen times on the drive and still could not say without his voice catching, because he had been a boy on this place once, and she had taught him to hold a keat in his cupped hands so gently it would not feel the difference between his palms and the world. Wren looked at him across the kitchen table, the same table, the wood worn pale now where 2 generations of elbows had rested. And she looked at him for a long, quiet moment in her way. And then she said yes, on one condition, and Toby braced for the same condition she'd given Priya all those years ago, the demand that Silas be credited. But that was not the condition. The condition was that they name the thing after nobody. No Callahan Institute, no Silas Callahan program, no Wren's name on a single page of it. Call it the Thistledown method, she said, or don't call it anything at all, because the whole point, The thing she'd spent her life learning and the thing her grandfather had died before he could teach her was that the knowledge belonged to the ground and not to the person. And the fastest way to kill a true thing was to hang somebody's name on it and let pride get between the bird and the tick. Toby wrote it down in a notebook of his own, the Thistledown method, and that was what it became, taught now in a dozen counties and printed on a plain photocopied sheet that anyone could take, unsigned, the way she'd always handed them out. The last time the valley gathered on Thistledown Road while Wren was still living, it was not for a hatching day. It was because Delphine Okafor, who had run the gas station at the Marrow Creek crossroads for 41 years, and had been, in her way, the first true believer, the first mouth to carry the story out into the world, had finally sold the station and was moving south to be near her daughter, and she'd asked, as her one going-away wish, to see the flock come in one more time. So they came, dozens of them, more than dozens, the Deverells and the Vosses and the Petronas and the sons and grandsons of men who'd laughed at the feed store, and they stood along Wren's fence in the September gold and waited. And at dusk the birds came, as they always came, pouring in a gray speckled tide across the darkening field, screaming their idiot beautiful heads off, unchanged in 50 years and 40 generations of birds, loyal to a patch of ground and a woman who fed them scratch at the same spot every evening the way she'd fed their great-great-grandmothers. Delphine wept and did not apologize for it, and Wren stood beside her and did not weep, but held her hand. And when the racket had settled and the birds had gone to roost in the cedars, Delphine said, "You know, I told 9 people that first day." And Wren said, "I know." And Delphine said, "I've thought about that a lot, how the whole thing turned on 9 people and a girl who wouldn't quit." And Wren said the thing she always said, that it hadn't turned on her at all, that it had turned on a man who noticed. And Delphine squeezed her hand and said, "Honey, he noticed, but you're the one who did something about it, and that's not nothing." And Wren was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "No, it's not nothing," which was, for her, a great deal to admit, and Delphine knew it, and they left it there in the dark with the birds. She died in the autumn, Wren Callahan, in her own bed in the little house on Thistledown Road, an old woman by then and not sick so much as finished, the way a field is finished when the last of the harvest is in, and Toby was with her, and the last thing she asked him to do was open the window so she could hear them come in. And he did, and they came, screaming across the field in the failing light, exactly as they had the first evening she'd turned Odell Marsh's 90 birds loose into the cedars and thought she'd thrown $400 into the woods, and she listened to them settle. And she died sometime in the night, with the window still open and the notebook on the table beside her, the last entry a single figure, none, undated, unfinished, or perhaps finished exactly. They buried her on the ridge beside Silas and Ada and Bess, where you can hear the guineas working the grass below. And Toby ran the hatching day the next spring and every spring after, and the flock goes on, loyal to the ground, and the tick counts stay small, and somewhere in 3 counties a child who never heard the word plague grows up clean. And if you drive out Thistledown Road in the evening, you can still see them come pouring in at dusk, 90 and more, the descendants of birds nobody wanted, screaming their beautiful heads off across a valley they saved without ever once being asked to, doing, in the failing light, with no one who remembers watching, exactly the thing they were always for.